gotta ask one hard question. Right?
To make us squirm. Get me in trouble with my friends at BYU. That's what you're trying to do.
Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. In our final conversation with Dr. Paul Reeve and Dr. Christopher Rich, they're the co-authors of This Abominable Slavery. It's all about Utah slavery. We're going to ask some provocative questions. What do critics think about this book? Is it changing the narrative with the priesthood ban, especially in the 19th century? We're also going to ask if BYU should be renamed and the Smoot Building. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out.
Those are the main things that happened in that time period.
Okay, so 52, 56, 57 with the Dred Scott decision. 1862, Paul, tell us what happened. And I keep wanting to say the Emancipation Proclamation. I know that's not it.
Yeah.
What did they call the law that freed slaves in the federal territories?
I think it's an act in relation to freedom.
Oh, really?
If I remember right, but your listeners can read the book and find out for sure. I believe that's it. So remember the Republican Party, its first presidential platform in 1856.
We have to talk about that.
Yeah, the Republican Party says when it runs its first presidential candidate, right, we have the right and imperative duty to prohibit in the territories the twin relics of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy. I have that memorized. I teach Utah history, right? That's their founding plank.
Right.
They believe that Republicans believe that they have the power, the right to prohibit in the territories. No one's talking about slavery in the states where it exists. Remember, that's a states' rights issue. That's a part of politics in the 1850s United States, right? But the Republicans say territories are different, and obviously they are, right? They're controlled by federal power, and therefore we can prohibit in the territories slavery and polygamy. When do politicians ever keep their word? They did it in 1862. Within weeks of each other, they pass a law prohibiting slavery in the territories and polygamy in the territories. So your listeners are probably familiar with the fact that the first anti-polygamy bill is passed in 1862.
The Edmunds Act.
The Morrill Act.
Oh, the Morrill Act. Sorry, Edmunds was later.
Yeah, Edmunds is later. 1862, within weeks, Abraham Lincoln also signs into law this act in relation to freedom that will criminalize slavery and involuntary servitude in all U.S. territories, not in the states. It's not the Emancipation Proclamation. It's not the 13th Amendment. Most people aren't familiar that there's something that precedes that the Republicans actually kept their 1856 pledge and passed this law prohibiting slavery and involuntary servitude in the territories. So that would have applied to Utah. Bernheisel, who is Utah's territorial delegate, is aware of this law, and he writes a letter to Brigham Young telling him, hey, this law is passed and it's just waiting this signature of Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln signs it, I believe, June 20th, if I remember right, 1862.
That's really close to June 19th.
It is, right? And so that would have been the legal end to...
So was it immediate? Or because I thought it waited until January for it was enacted. No, it was immediate?
That's the Emancipation Proclamation.
Okay, that's what I'm getting.
Emancipation Proclamation is passed in September, and then it goes into effect January 1st, but only in states that are in rebellion against the Union.
1865, right?
No, 1863.
Okay.
1863. The 13th Amendment is 1865.
Okay.
Yeah. So this one only applies to the territories.
Okay.
And it would have gone into effect immediately. So Bernheisel makes Brigham Young aware. It's just awaiting the president's signature. The president does sign it. And then in July, the Deseret News publishes notice that the president has signed this law.
But I noticed you said it was buried on page 4 with a little fanfare.
Page 4, tucked into a column just simply called From Washington, right? No banner headlines, no yay, like slavery has been abolished in Utah territory. Just in the middle of a column, just one sentence, like the president has signed this law that bars slavery in the territories, right? So Is anyone making the enslavers aware?
Right.
Has anyone told the enslaved? And do they even think that this applies to the law that they have passed? Those are all open questions.
Oh, you're talking about the act in relation to service.
relation to service. Do they think that it even applies? Because if they're like Brigham Young, he's saying this is not involuntary servitude and this is not chattel slavery.
Oh, because they've consented.
Right. Right. Those are open questions, right?
Okay.
Those are all open questions. So legally, 1862 would have been the end of slavery in Utah Territory. In practice,
Did anybody know?
did they know, right? Were enslaved people freed in 1862? Did they have to wait until the 13th Amendment in 1865? The Emancipation Proclamation wouldn't have applied to them. So did they have to wait until the 13th Amendment in 1865? Those are all open questions. We don't find any enslaved people telling us when they found out about it. Alex Bankhead once again says, yeah, when we found out, we celebrated that we were free, right? Doesn't recall a timeline, doesn't recall a date, anything like that. He just says, you know, enslaved people were thrilled when we found out we were freed. So we don't know if enslavers were aware. Were the enslaved aware? How did this play out in practice? And that's the open question. So the concluding chapter is called Utah's Juneteenth, and we have a firm date for its legal end, but in practice, it's left open to question.
I mean, do you have any sense? We know that the notice was buried in page 4. Mm-hmm. Who knows who read it? Was the act you just said, or the Emancipation Proclamation, probably was promoted a lot more. Do you have a sense for those other two acts, if they had more publicity in Utah?
I don't know about the Emancipation Proclamation, but remember that only applied to states in rebellion, and Utah wasn't in rebellion, and it was a territory.
Okay.
So you'd have to go to the 13th Amendment, 1865.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't know how those were announced in Utah newspapers.
We do know that by 1866, an act in relation to service no longer appears in territorial laws.
Okay.
So
did it appear up until then?
it did. So there was a compilation of laws, and they put it together every 5 years or so. I can't remember the exact intro between it. But so they did a new compilation of territorial laws in 1866. And an act in relation to service does not appear in there. So as Paul was saying, there's a lot of open questions about how they viewed this congressional statute. They may have interpreted it to mean it didn't actually apply to an act in relation to service. This was, in addition to the slavery and servitude question, there were major arguments in legislatures and in courthouses about what constituted voluntary servitude versus involuntary servitude. And that actually continues well past the Civil War. There's a lot of disagreement about what is the nature of consent. And it's very easy for us now to look back and say, how could an enslaved person possibly consent? That makes a lot of sense to us. At the time, this was a major question. What is required to make consent real? Can you ever take away somebody's ability to consent? And a lot of people essentially answered no. As long as somebody is not insane, they can make a free choice, even if they're enslaved.
Even if they're 3 years old.
Well, and that's even at the time, they didn't necessarily think a minor could consent. But anyway, but that remained a serious question. So sometime, presumably between 1862 and 1866, somebody made the determination something applies to an act in relation to service. And surprisingly, we can't find anywhere where the legislature debates the question, where they repeal it, or anything else. It's no longer
just
there
disappears.
But interestingly, so in that 1866 compilation, the Act for the Further Relief of Indian Slaves and Prisoners is still there.
Oh.
So they didn't think that the involuntary servitude applied to that indenture, Native American indenture bill, right? Because it's still in the
so
in the
Native
books.
Americans can still be indentured,
right? Well, right. Again, open questions in terms of how long that lasts. It disappears by the 1876 compilation, so a decade later, it's no longer included.
and these are published every 5 years. You think?
I can't recall precisely.
Roughly.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we know that other scholars have documented at least 400, roughly 400 Native American children in Latter-day Saint homes, so that even if that law disappears, it's still taking place just according to custom, right?
Okay.
And that's up through the turn of the 20th century.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So it disappears from the legal compilation by 1876, but it's still in the 1866 compilation.
So we really don't know on the boots on the ground how slaves or even indentured servants knew about this between 1862 and 1866, right?
Right. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the open question. That's the point we make in the last chapter is in practice, how did they find out? And we don't know. We've found no evidence to determine one way or the other. Legally, they would have been freed in 1862 at the earliest. Yeah.
Okay.
If they knew about it.
If they knew about it.
Yeah.
I don't know that people are running around telling them, not like Paul Reeve, I think.
Right. Right. And remember, that's why we have Juneteenth, right? It's Galveston, Texas.
Right.
A couple of months after the end of the Civil War, before they find out, right? June 19th, they find enslaved people, but it takes, federal troops and then the arrival of the Freedmen's Bureau to actually enforce it, right?
This is in 1865, right? Or 1866?
Yeah, 1865.
Right. Because the war ends in April.
And it's not until June that word arrives in Texas, right? Galveston, Texas, June 19th. So that becomes Juneteenth for when they find out about their freedom. So that's a couple of months after the war. And then it also takes people on the ground, federal troops on the ground, as well as the Freedmen's Bureau that comes in to actually help them achieve the freedom that they have been granted, right? What are your economic opportunities? Some of them end up working back on their plantations because what are their other options, right? And their enslavers are sometimes, former enslavers are promising them compensation, but some of them later say, I wasn't paid anything, right? They're doing extra work to earn money on their side so they can get enough money to go elsewhere, right?
50 acres and a mule, right?
Some of them end up working as sharecroppers back on the same plantation that they worked before, right? So there are a variety of ways that are kept close. And then the black codes start being written, right, to get them close to their former plantation. So it's an open question for Utah Territory in terms of just how do they know and when do they know.
These questions also play out in places like New Mexico. So in New Mexico, they had legalized something called peonage, which is a form of debt servitude, which somebody goes into debt and then you can hold them in service until they ultimately pay off the debt. In practice, it's almost impossible to pay off that debt, so it ends up being a form of perpetual servitude. There's arguments there for years about whether this is a form of voluntary servitude or involuntary servitude. And it's not until 1867 Congress steps in and finally says, we don't care whether it's voluntary or not. And they pass an anti-peonage bill that illegalizes forms of involuntary and voluntary servitude. And so we tend to think of these things in easy categories.
Yeah.
Slavery exists, now it doesn't exist. And in fact, it's very complicated and very nuanced. And
that's what historians always say.
but it's true. And that's one of the things we try to do with the book is just to show how complicated it really is. We like easy answers. and that's fine.
Historians don't.
I don't think this has easy answers in it.
Yeah, it's messy. So that's one of the takeaways, right? It's messy, and it's difficult to sort of ferret out over time, what it meant in the minds of the legislators and how it played out in practice for the Native American and African American enslaved.
Yeah.
And we try to answer both of those questions and openly acknowledge we do so imperfectly.
Okay. Well, it's only been out, 4 days right now?
People are starting to actually get their copies. Yes.
So, I know there's a peer review process because clearly the public hasn't had a chance to push back on you guys. But have you guys gotten any pushback on your book that you can share?
Well, I mean, there's some skepticism on the interpretation of is an act in relationship to service a form of gradual emancipation, right?
Okay.
And Oxford has anonymous peer reviewers, right? And so I think we had really good peer reviewers who, pressed us on some of the claims that we made, and I think we refined our arguments as a result. And so I think what is published is more refined than in the original draft. And we simply acknowledge, right? So they removed 18 words that we believe would have passed on the condition of servitude to the next generation, but they don't replace those 18 words with, therefore you can't pass on the condition to the next generation. Positive language that would have said, we're not passing on the condition. So it's left up to us to infer that their intent was that the condition not pass on to the next generation. We actually offer readers a scan of the original draft of the bill where they cross out those 18 words. And then we provide our own transcript, right? So you can read for yourself the original version of the bill with those 18 words included, and then with those 18 words removed, what do you think the intent was? If you take out the clause that would have passed on the condition to the next generation, we think that means the intent of lawmakers was that it not pass on, and therefore that creates a gradual form of emancipation. But that's open for interpretation, right?
Well,
and they deliberately, we don't know about deliberately. They draft the bill ambiguously, right? And we don't know if that's because, they're just not great lawmakers or if they're doing it deliberately.
Well, and the question is, are we aware of any children born between, say, 1852 and 1862 that slavery was passed on to them? Are you aware of that?
So we tried to look at that, and there's just not a whole lot of evidence. So any of the children who were actually born in Utah by 1862, if we use that as the basic end date, still would have been minors. So they still would have been living with their parents in the homes of their masters. And we do find evidence that they are there. There is some evidence that some children were sold. Now, those children weren't born in Utah. So you can make the argument that the law didn't cover them, but it was a very small number of children. By the 1860s, I think it was roughly 10. And so we try to make a case of, based on the language of the law, this is what should have happened, but we don't know for sure what would have happened in practice had the law continued on for another 10 or 15 or 20 years.
So it's just too short of a time frame.
Correct.
Okay.
And we make the point, right, that if you are a child, you arrive in Utah territory, you can die enslaved in Utah territory, right? This is only applied to those who would be born in Utah territory after arrival.
Right.
That's how the law is written. So, if you're born in 1852, you're only 10 years old by 1862, you're still living with your parents, and how do historians know what your legal status might have been?
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Any other pushback?
Over the years, there has been more pushback. When we first brought this idea forward,
I remember that session at San Antonio.
So back in 2012, when we brought this idea up really for the first time,
You got some serious pushback.
in MHA at San Antonio. There was a lot of pushback against this.
Yeah.
And that's reasonable. I mean, these are hard ideas. They're complicated ideas. I would say that as time has gone on, it has felt like more people are, even while there is pushback against individual parts of our analysis about the gradual emancipation and so forth, I think there has been a more openness to those ideas. At least that's been my experience.
Well, I think, people can read the evidence for themselves. So we have released all of the documents, so all the speeches.
Give us the website.
So www.thisabominableslavery.org. And anyone can go there. They can read Brigham Young's 5th of February, 1852 speech for themselves. All of the documents related to, or most of the documents related to the book are, freely available, publicly available, and with the cooperation of the Church History Department. So people can read the evidence for themselves and also understand that new evidence has come to light, right? And so the notion that Euro-Americans are included in this service bill is something new that prior scholars had missed. But the debate makes it clear that that's what they're talking about because they say that when they're debating, right? That's a part of what they're talking about.
Oh, wow.
And if you arrive indebted to the person that provided you passage to America and you die before you pay it off, can your debt then be passed on to your children? That's also part of what they're debating. So they're talking explicitly about Euro-Americans, right? So prior scholars didn't have access to that, right? So we think...
Thanks to Legene.
Big
shout out to Legene.
Exactly. we think that, there's evidence at least to support our claims, and there might be people who, have questions one way or the other. But nonetheless, that's what scholarship is, right? You put it out into the public and people respond. We think the evidence is there, right? I think, a part of the issue is people might think we're saying slavery didn't exist in Utah Territory. We're not saying that. We're not saying that. We fully recognize, right? Enslaved people arrive July 22nd, 1847, right? And we talk about this legal kind of effort and also acknowledge from the perspective of the enslaved that
it didn't make much difference.
It probably didn't make much difference, right? So we're not denying any of that. And, so the way that the question might be asked, was Utah a slave territory, right? Utah is not a state through any of this. And the new evidence suggests that Brigham Young is really clear for any application for statehood will not be as a slave state.
That's really interesting and important to know.
But everyone needs to remember Utah remains a territory through this period. It's never a state. Okay, so as a territory, the law that is passed gives those who have enslaved people in Utah the ability to continue to hold them, yet gives them some rights, right, to protect the enslaved.
Elevates from slavery to servitude.
Yeah, but they're not free.
Right.
But they're not free. And we have this new firm piece of evidence from the 1856 Constitutional Convention that the effort to apply explicitly as a slave state is soundly voted down. And Brigham Young supports that. He makes it clear. He's upset with George A. Smith. George A. Smith is the only apostle who votes in favor of the proposal to send this to D.C. as a slave constitution. And Brigham Young finds out about it and calls George A. Smith on the carpet and says, I'm not going to send you with this constitution if you're in favor of slavery.
Oh, wow.
So we had Brigham Young's interview with Horace Greeley in 1859 where he says, no, Utah won't go into the Union as a slave state. And some historians had argued, well, that's kind of Brigham Young just, playing this public relations game. We have now his evidence from 1856 where he's clear that he does not support an application as a slave state.
Well, and really throughout this entire period, Brigham Young is remarkably consistent in his views towards slavery. While he does sometimes use ambiguous language, and we are very forthright that sometimes he uses ambiguous language, he is very clear that one person should not be able to own another as property. He believes that that is both legally and morally wrong. But the question is, how do we deal legally with enslaved people now that they are here? And he is trying to do this in a context of national controversy over slavery. He wants Deseret admitted to the Union as a state. And the advice that he is receiving from many people, including Thomas Paine, is you do not want to deal with this issue. Slavery could sink you. You don't want to come out openly one way or the other.
Just be neutral.
Be neutral. Says it multiple times. At the same time, Brigham Young is trying to ensure that there is no split within the Latter-day Saint church and community over this question. In the 1830s and 40s, three major American denominations, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and the Methodists, all split over the question of slavery. Brigham Young wants to ensure that that does not happen. So Brigham Young seems to be walking on this tightrope, where on the one hand, he does not want to legalize chattel slavery in Utah. He does not want to hold people and property, but sees real problems with immediate abolition at the same time. And so he's trying to come up with this more moderate solution to the problem.
And, Orson Pratt is pushing for a free labor ethic at the same time, right? And he's also a product of this 19th century culture. And one of the chapters, we, just walk readers through this debate between Orson Pratt and Brigham Young.
Yeah.
And Orson Pratt obviously, is, pushing forward, and Brigham Young is reaching back. And we think Orson Pratt, or at least I'll speak for myself, Orson Pratt has the better argument here, right? Right. He has made a free labor argument, and history has been on his side, right? And we lay that out in that chapter, what are the ramifications of these two arguments, right? As these two men sort of represent these forces that are at play in the broader American nation. And remember that question that Utah is grappling with. Can human beings be held as property? Is a question that the nation itself cannot solve. And it devolves into civil war in 1861 and costs the nation 600,000 lives. And we're simply placing Utah territory within that context, that broader national context. 1850s is just this decade of sectional divide where the nation is straining the fabric of union to the point that we start killing each other over that question.
Very good. That's kind of a somber note to end on, though. But is there anything we missed?
I think we covered most of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I only had it for about 3 or 4 days. I got through 3 chapters. But it's a great book. From the 3 chapters I've read so far have been great. And so I would recommend it to everybody. Why don't you show them to me again? Who do you got on the cover there? It looks like I recognize a few people.
So Brigham Young, and we all, Brigham Young and Orson Pratt on either side, so representing the debate. And then in the middle is Sally Young Kanaj and Green Flake. So we also then tried to represent, Native American and African American enslaved. And the 2 pictures here we chose as close to what they may have looked like in 1852.
Oh, really?
So this picture taken roughly around 1850, and this one, I think 1853. I can't remember for sure, of Orson Pratt. So that was our intent, was to try to find an 1850s kind of image of both men.
Well, that's very good. Was Orson Pratt the guy that argued, changing topics slightly, against Adam God.
Correct.
And Brigham Young. And so Orson, when he was supposed to be the prophet, but he lost his seniority, right?
Correct. He was dropped from the quorum over his objection to polygamy, interestingly enough.
Oh, wow. And then he announced it.
Right. And so at the end of 1852, he's the one that Brigham Young turns to publicly announce the practice of polygamy. But yeah, those two butt heads on several occasions. So remember when Brigham Young tries to reconstitute the first presidency at Winter Quarters, Orson Pratt originally objects.
Oh, yeah.
So they butt heads there, and they're butting heads in 1852 in the legislative session, and then they don't agree theologically over the Adam God theory that Brigham Young is proposing, and Orson Pratt doesn't buy that.
Things were much more lively back then.
They were, yeah. And people were more...
days before correlation.
Yes. They were more open about their disagreements, too, right?
Yeah.
And Orson Pratt, very open about his disagreements with Brigham Young, right? They are standing up to each other in the legislative session.
But also they would have these disagreements and then come back together again for different purposes. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there are times when Brigham is very harsh towards Orson Pratt, as he could be harsh towards other people as well. Yet he goes to Orson Pratt to discuss polygamy. And like everything else, these were complicated relationships.
And I think that's also interesting that Orson Pratt then becomes a defender of polygamy, right? He changes from, his original sort of abhorrence, right, and becomes a defender of polygamy for the rest of his life. Interestingly, there's only a one-off in terms of his defense of the racial priesthood restriction and never returns to it, right? So it's an interesting comparison. It makes me wonder, right? I wish there was more evidence, but, why did he do that 1853 newspaper article and never return to it? I don't think he was convinced himself of the racial restrictions. Never comes back to defending it. And when he becomes convinced about polygamy, he defends it for the rest of his life.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So I have one more question, especially since you're both BYU grads.
Uh-oh.
You know where this is going. There's been some debate about a couple of things, whether BYU should be renamed because Brigham Young supported slavery, which we've talked about. But also, we didn't spend a lot of time on Abraham Smoot. There's the Abraham Smoot Administration Building. People think it should be renamed. He was a bishop. He had slaves. What do you think of that controversy?
Well, I spoke at the BYU slavery conference. So they have there's a BYU. There was a group at BYU who studied BYU's connection to slavery, right? I think at the very least, just a plaque or some sort of public acknowledgement at the Smoot Building, right, that would acknowledge his three enslaved people that, Tom, Jerry, and Sally, just an acknowledgement of them and their lives could go a long way in, just being more open about his connection to enslaved people.
Okay. So you're not in favor of renaming either the building or the university?
Oh, I didn't say that.
Okay.
You're trying to pin me down. I don't have any say at all in terms of those kind of questions.
You have an opinion, though.
Well, I don't foresee any sort of reasonable kind of effort at changing the name of the university. I think it will always be Brigham Young University. What I understand on the campus is that buildings no longer will no longer be named after people.
Oh, Lavelle Edwards Stadium.
Buildings will no longer be named after people. And the Lavelle Edwards Stadium already exists, and all of the named buildings already exist, but future buildings are not going to be named after people.
Is it because of this reason? I mean, I guess you're speculating here because, we're going to always find dirt on somebody. So somebody's going to offend something.
Yeah, I don't know. You have to ask BYU. But I think there are things they can do. So, the BYU Slavery Reconciliation Project is modeled after slavery reconciliation projects that have happened at other universities. So University of Virginia has a large memorial to enslaved people, right? Georgetown has gone through a reconciliation process. So I think there are things that they could do that would acknowledge the enslaved people. If they're going to leave Abraham Smoot on the administration building, that's their decision. There are things they could do that would also acknowledge the enslaved people of Abraham Smoot. These have happened at other campuses across the nation, right, where campuses have studied their own connections to the enslaved past and come up with ways that they are openly acknowledging them. And I'm not sure that BYU has come up with a firm proposal. I spoke at the slavery conference about the debate between Orson Pratt and Brigham Young.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wish I'd have known about that. Yeah. There's too many conferences.
Yeah.
Chris, what's your perspective on Smoot and Brigham Young?
My hope is that people will be able to come away, hopefully after reading the book, understanding various perspectives. Mm-hmm. And people will be able to come up with their own conclusions. That's one of the things we wanted, why we wanted to have our research open to the public on the website, is so that people could read through this for themselves. We think we've put forward the best interpretation of what happened in the 52 legislature from a variety of different perspectives. And my hope is that regardless of what happens anywhere else, is that people will be able to look at these individuals as people that were facing significant problems, and whether or not we agree with the conclusions that they came to try and be able to understand where they were coming from, both from those people who were in this legislature and from those people who were held in service and to whom these laws applied.
Should the Smoot building be renamed? I'm not going to let you off the hook there. You can say no comment or whatever.
No comment.
Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Chris, soon to be Dr.
Almost.
Chris
PhD candidate.
And Dr. Paul Reeve, thank you so much for being here on Gospel Tangents. And go buy the book if you don't have it. It should sell out just like Matt Harris's book did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help sell it out. All right. Thanks again for being here on Gospel Tangents.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Paul Reeve and soon to be Dr. Christopher Rich. So they're the co-authors, along with Legene Carruth, of This Abominable Slavery. It's a fantastic book. And I want to just give a shout out to Legene. Thank you so much for the amazing work you did on this book. Wish we could have sat down and talked a little bit more. In our next conversation, we're going to jump into another sticky topic, polygamy. Dr. Christopher Smith is going to talk about Joseph's proposals to Emma and his other wives, as well as the Fanny Alger incident. Was that a case of law of adoption?
We're not just recasting the Fanny Alger event. We're recasting the whole theological history of the sealing power and of polygamy in the Mormon Church. We're offering a new origin story for polygamy that I think is really cool.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt, so check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.